Beneath the veil of stars, before histories were carved in ink and stone, there was the land. A land of ash and shifting fire, where mountains breathed smoke into the heavens, and rivers cut silent paths through blackened earth. This was Restained long before it bore the name Morrowind, a place both hostile and sacred, cradled by winds that carried whispers of forgotten dawns. The ashlands stretched endless and unmeasured, a desert of shifting gray. Every grain of soot carried memory of eruptions, of molten flows, of a world still being formed. And in those clouds of drifting ash, one might imagine the dreams of the gods themselves, stirred and scattered by the breath of Red Mountain. The mountain rose vast, a titan of stone, the heart of the land. Its peak loomed higher than clouds, its slopes littered with rivers of stone long cooled into jagged teeth. It was said, even then, that the mountain did not sleep, that beneath its crust there pulsed a rhythm, a secret heartbeat, as though the land itself awaited its destiny. Forests clung stubbornly to the coasts, their roots dark with volcanic soil. Moss grew thick upon damp stones, and ferns unfurled in hidden groves. Along the western bays, waters swelled and ebbed in cycles unbroken, carrying salt and life alike. But deeper inland, the breath of the ashlands smothered all. There, the air tasted of cinder, and silence fell heavy, broken only by the hiss of unseen fumaroles and the restless shifting of the ground. In this land before history, the creatures of myth stirred. Netch floated like silent lanterns across the mists. Goers treaded softly, their shapes moving through the haze like ancient shadows. The air was alive with cries both mournful and beautiful, and to wander alone in such places was to feel both awe and smallness. It was a land that humbled and exalted, where survival was never granted, only earned. And yet, amid such severity, there was sanctity. The ash did not only burn, it preserved. The storms that scoured the skin also polished the spirit, and those who walked among them found themselves changed. The people who would later come to dwell in these lands would see it not only as home, but as teacher, punisher, and parent. For in the harshness of ash and fire, they glimpsed truths greater than comfort. Even then, before the Dwemer carved their halls into stone, before the Chimer followed Veleth across the wastes, the land was waiting. Waiting for footsteps, waiting for choices, waiting for the endless weaving of betrayal and devotion that would one day echo across the ages. The earth, the sky, the fire, they bore silent witness. And in their silence, they spoke to those who could hear, "This land is sacred, and it will remember." So the ashlands endured. Storm after storm, eruption after eruption, silence after silence. Each cycle folded into another, as though the land itself was weaving a lullaby, a song of ash and stone. And in that lullaby lay the first chapter of Tamriel's memory, not spoken by mortals, but whispered by the land itself. Long before council and covenant, before temples rose and laws were written, two peoples walked upon the ash. They were bound to the same land, yet their hearts turned to different horizons. The Dwemer, deep delvers, kin of stone and metal. The Chimer, pilgrims of Veleth, seekers of divine fire. Each, in their way, reflected the mountain they dwelt beneath, unyielding, mysterious, eternal. The Dwemer came first to the caverns, carving homes not beneath the sun, but in the marrow of the earth. Their halls rang with the chime of hammer and the hiss of molten forge. They were a people who trusted not in gods, but in their own hands, their own craft, their own reason. To them, the ashlands above were hostile and barren, but below lay infinite promise. Veins of ore, chambers of silence, and mysteries of the Orbis that could be measured, tested, mastered. They believed divinity itself could be known through numbers, through craft, through the shaping of raw creation. The Chimer, by contrast, lifted their eyes to the sky and beyond it to realms invisible. They were wanderers, descended from the Aldmer, but forever changed by their devotion to Daedric lords. Guided by Veleth the prophet, they had turned away from Somerset's bright spires, choosing instead the austere gift of hardship. To them, the ash was holy, the storms a baptism, the land itself a shrine of trial. Every stone and every flame was seen as the touch of their patrons. Bothia, Mephala, Azura, dark yet guiding hands that shaped their destiny. Where the Dwemer found silence in deep stone, the Chimer heard voices in the wind. And yet, though their ways diverged, the two peoples lived side by side. On the surface, villages of the Chimer clung to riverbanks and coasts, smoke rising from simple hearths. Beneath, Dwemer cities spread like roots unseen, vast and hidden, lit not by sun but by the glow of ingenious craft. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they quarreled, but always there was distance, a gulf not of land but of thought. For the Dwemer mistrusted devotion, and the Chimer mistrusted pride without reverence. They looked upon one another as kin estranged, alike in form, yet worlds apart in soul. Still, there were moments of kinship, fleeting yet true. In the long winters of Ashfall, Dwemer merchants would bring metal goods to Chimer settlements. In return, the Chimer offered food, salt, and woven cloth. There were shared feasts, shared hunts, and for a time, a fragile rhythm of coexistence. It was as though the land itself willed that both survive, two halves of a greater whole, bound to one mountain, one destiny. But beneath the surface of such balance lay unease. The Dwemer, secretive and withdrawn, guarded their lore with silence. The Chimer, devout and fiery, spoke often of their faith, proclaiming their devotion with zeal. Their children grew with different stories, their elders taught different truths. And though the mountain loomed above them both, each looked upon it with eyes that saw utterly different things. To the Chimer, it was the throne of gods, the watchful altar of Azura. To the Dwemer, it was merely stone, stone that hid a secret yet to be unlocked. Thus the stage was set, long before war was whispered, long before betrayal was named. Two peoples, kindred yet estranged, walking the same land yet never the same path. Their fates twined by soil and fire, yet their visions forever divided. And the land, as ever, endured, silent and knowing. For Rhysdain was patient, and in patience it bore witness to the first of many rifts. Beneath the shifting ash and the restless sky, the Dwemer built their realm of silence. They were not a people of temples or open plazas. Their hearts were drawn downward, into caverns, into hidden chambers where no storm could reach. There, the air was cool and dry, lit by the glow of forges and lamps whose design only they understood. Stone was their scripture, and metal their verse. Where others prayed, the Dwemer calculated. Where others sought visions, they sought answers etched in brass and steam. They were artisans beyond compare, shaping machines that walked as if alive. Through gears, pistons, and secret fires, they mimicked life itself, and some whispered that their creations were more obedient than any mortal servant. Every city of theirs rang with the hum of machinery, a song of invention that echoed through endless halls. They did not look to the Daedra for guidance, nor did they bend their knees before Edra. To them, divinity was not to be worshipped, but to be understood, measured, and perhaps surpassed. Their philosophers spoke in riddles of tone and number, in theorems that wound like clockwork. They debated the nature of the soul, of being, of eternity itself. And though much of their speech was cloaked in secrecy, the heart of their pursuit was clear. They sought to master the hidden fabric of existence, to unravel the threads that bound gods and mortals alike. The Heart of Lorkhan, though not yet revealed, was the dream toward which they unknowingly walked. Always they sought the impossible. Always they pressed beyond the limits that others accepted as divine decree. To outsiders, their ways seemed cold, even arrogant. The Chimer whispered that the Dwemer were soulless, blind to truths greater than stone. But within their own halls, the Dwemer did not see themselves as blind. They believed they were visionaries, casting aside the shackles of superstition. Their craft was their faith, their logic, their guiding flame. And in their silence, they cultivated a power unlike any other. The cities they carved were wonders hidden from the sun. Walls of brass gleamed with strange lights. Corridors stretched vast, their pillars carved with intricate designs that seemed at once alien and precise. Great engines turned in the depths, their purpose half forgotten even by those who tended them. Yet all was built with intent, with patience, with the certainty that knowledge gained was never lost. Every creation, no matter how small, was another step toward eternity. And so the Dwemer lived, deep in their hidden kingdoms, removed from the cycles of war and prayer that consumed others. They endured storms without feeling their touch, and their knowledge grew like roots spreading unseen. But in their silence, in their withdrawal, they also fostered distance. They saw themselves apart, above, separate from those who lived in the light. It was a distance that would one day widen into a gulf no alliance could bridge. For the Dwemer sought eternity not in reverence, but in control. They did not ask what the gods desired of them. They asked instead how the very seat of divinity might be seized, studied, and shaped by mortal hands. In this, they laid the foundation of their greatness and the seed of their doom. Upon the same land where the Dwemer delved, another people walked in the open air. The Chimer, golden-skinned and flame-eyed, bore with them the legacy of Veleth the prophet. They were wanderers once, forsaking Somerset's marble towers, forsaking the worship of Edra who seemed distant and cold. Veleth had led them eastward, into hardship, into exile, into a land of ash and trial. And though the path was bitter, they embraced it, believing that through struggle they drew nearer to truth. Theirs was a faith of passion, of devotion to Daedric lords both dark and luminous. Bothia, the prince of plots and transformation, was revered as the champion of change, the fire that remakes the old into new. Mephala, the spinner of webs, was their guide in secrets, in hidden dealings, in the weaving of destiny itself. And Azura, queen of twilight, offered them prophecy, dreams, and the soft promise of guidance in shadow. These three, above all, were their teachers, their patrons, their holy family. And through them, the Chimers shaped their lives not around reason alone, but around covenant and sacrifice. Their villages clung to rivers and shores, humble yet sacred. Huts of reed and timber rose near waters, their hearths smoking against the cold nights. Simple though their homes were, their lives burned with ritual. Every hunt was offered to the spirits. Every fire was lit with prayer. Children grew not merely with skill, but with stories, tales of gods who walked beside them, who demanded not comfort, but loyalty. And so each generation learned to see the ash as gift, the storm as test, the land itself as holy writ. The Chimer believed suffering was not cruelty, but instruction. When ash blinded their eyes, they said Azura was reminding them of humility. When rival clans fought and blood was spilled, they whispered that Mephala was teaching the dance of consequence. When tyrants fell and old ways crumbled, they proclaimed Bothia's fire had burned falsehood to ash. Faith was not gentle to them. It was fierce, consuming, absolute. Yet within that fierceness was a unity, a fire that bound their people together even in hardship. They looked upon the Dwemer with wary eyes. How could kin of Mare walk the same land, yet spurn the gods who gave it meaning? How could they shape brass and steam, yet deny the spirit that dwelled within every living thing? To the Chimer, the Dwemer seemed proud but blind, children of stone who mistook silence for wisdom, and so mistrust lingered, even in times of peace. Though trade was shared and alliances sometimes formed, the Chimer whispered that those below the earth had forgotten the sky. But the Chimer were not without flaw. Their devotion, so fiery and absolute, sometimes burned too hot. They quarreled among themselves over interpretations of prophecy. Clans rose and fell, feuds long as lifetimes. And yet, in every cycle, they returned to their faith, finding in it a thread that bound them, a fire that would not be extinguished. Thus the Chimer lived, faithful wanderers who made of ash a temple and of trial a teacher. Their eyes burned with conviction, their hearts with devotion. They believed they walked a path set not by their own hand, but by the will of gods who saw in them a chosen people. And though they did not yet know it, that chosen path would lead them not only to glory, but to betrayal, to sorrow, and to transformation beyond imagining. Amid the echoing halls of brass and stone, there rose a leader whose name would one day be spoken in both reverence and sorrow. Dwemer, called the Dwarf King, though no dwarf in stature, but a king in might and wisdom. He was the unifier of his people, the Dwemer of Restain, and in his reign their fractured clans were bound together in purpose. Strong of will, steady of hand, Dwemer looked not to temples or visions, but to the enduring clarity of reason. Yet in him there dwelt not only logic, but the rare gift of vision that could bridge clan with clan and dream with dream. The Dwemer were not easily led. Each hold and city prized its own secrets. Each clan guarded its autonomy with jealous care. But Dwemer, through diplomacy and strength alike, wove them into one. He walked among their cities, from the forges of Vardenfell to the deep halls of Stonefalls, speaking not as tyrant, but as kin. He promised a future where the Dwemer would endure as more than scattered holds, where their craft and thought would shine brighter than any sun above. And in his voice there was conviction, the kind that stilled doubts and bound loyalty. In the eyes of his people, Dwemer was more than ruler. He was guardian. He kept safe the mysteries of Kagrenac and the forges of innovation. He protected their halls against raiders and storms, and he ensured that their works grew not in secrecy alone, but in strength shared. He was a king not of vanity, but of purpose. And under his reign, the Dwemer thrived, their cities expanding, their craft reaching heights unseen before or after. Yet there was another side to Dwemer, one rarely sung in Dwemer halls, but remembered in Chimer tales. For he was not only a king to his own people, but a bridge, one who reached beyond the rift of faith and philosophy. It was he who looked upon Nerevar, the Chimer general, not as rival, but as equal. It was he who dared dream that Dwemer and Chimer might stand side by side, despite their differences, despite their gods and silences. Such was his courage, and such was his tragedy. Dwemer was no zealot, no tyrant blinded by pride. He was thoughtful, deliberate, a ruler who measured his words with care. But he was also resolute, unwilling to yield where he believed truth was clear. This blend of reason and iron made him beloved by his kin and respected by his allies. He was in every sense a king of the Dwemer, unyielding as stone, enduring as brass, yet not without the spark of kinship that could warm even the harshest heart. And yet, though history would one day remember him as a figure shrouded in betrayal, in this time he was not yet broken by war. He was a leader in the prime of his vision, standing at the threshold of possibility. In his halls rang not cries of battle, but the hum of promise. The Dwemer looked to him and saw the strength of their future, unshaken, unbowed. And Dwemer, in his wisdom, looked outward toward the possibility of peace, toward the alliance that would mark both his glory and his doom. Thus Dwemer stood, Dwarf King of the Dwemer, dreamer of unity, ruler of reason. A man whose name would echo through ages, not for the victories he won, but for the bonds he forged and the betrayal that would one day sever them. Where Dwemer's halls rang with metal and stone, there walked another figure, shaped not by gears but by faith and fire. Nerevar, called Moon and Star, was the heart of the Chimer, their general, their shield, their chosen champion. His name carried weight even in his youth, for he bore not only skill in battle, but wisdom rare among warriors. He was a leader who listened, who tempered judgment with care, and whose loyalty to his people burned brighter than any flame. To speak of the Chimer in those days was to speak also of Nerevar, for in him their hopes found form. The Chimer were a proud and fractious people. Clans warred, rivalries smoldered, and faith sometimes divided as much as it united. But Nerevar stood among them as mediator, as unifier. He carried the blessing of Azura, so it was said, and the favor of Bothio's fire. When quarrels rose, his voice calmed. When enemies threatened, his blade defended. He was both warrior and statesman, servant of his gods, yet mindful of the needs of his people. Legends speak of his presence, tall, stern, yet kind. He was fierce in battle, wielding sword and spear with unmatched skill. Yet outside the field he was known for gentleness. He cared for the weak, spoke with the lowly, and treated even his rivals with measured respect. In this, he was unlike many of his kin, who saw humility as weakness. For Nerevar, humility was strength, a sign of the gods' guidance, a reminder that even leaders walk paths set by powers beyond themselves. It was Nerevar who forged bonds that others thought impossible. Though Chimer mistrusted Dwemer, though faith and reason seemed forever at odds, Nerevar looked upon Domak and saw not an enemy, but a partner. He saw in the Dwarf King the same desire for unity, the same vision of a land not torn by endless strife, but bound in shared purpose. And in this recognition, a friendship was born, fragile, improbable, yet true. Together, they would dream of a first council, a gathering of peoples long estranged, standing at last in cautious harmony. But Nerevar was not only a figure of politics. He was a man of prophecy, bound by fate as much as by choice. Upon his hand he bore the moon and star, a ring said to have been blessed by the gods, a token of destiny that none but he could wear without perishing. This ring marked him not only as leader, but as chosen, set apart for trials yet unseen, for burdens heavier than any mortal ought to bear. And though he wore it with quiet dignity, its weight pressed upon him always, a reminder that his path was not entirely his own. The people loved him for this. They saw in Nerevar a man both mortal and destined, both near and far. He walked among them as one of their own, yet his name already echoed with myth. Children learned songs of his valor. Elders spoke prayers in his honor. Even those who doubted still followed, for his presence kindled trust that no decree alone could summon. And yet, like Domak, his story was one not only of greatness, but of tragedy. For though his heart sought unity, his destiny was bound to betrayal. The alliance he forged, the friendships he cherished, would one day break upon the stones of Red Mountain. And in the moment of his death, the gods themselves would turn and the land would never be the same. For now, though, he stood as beacon, Nerevar, moon and star, general of the Chimer, friend of Domak, chosen of prophecy. His footsteps echoed not only in the Ashlands, but in the dreams of an entire people. And in those dreams, a fragile hope was born, destined to blaze brightly before it was consumed by shadow. In the shadow of Red Mountain, where ash drifted like slow-falling snow, there came at last a moment of fragile accord. Domak, Dwarf King of the Dwemer, and Nerevar, moon and star of the Chimer, stood together, leaders of peoples long estranged. What once had been mistrust began to soften into recognition, and from recognition into covenant. This was the birth of the First Council, a gathering not of clans alone, but of visions. It was not peace born of ease, but peace hammered like metal in the forge, shaped, tempered, and held by will. The council brought together voices as different as stone and flame. The Dwemer, with their measured speech, spoke of trade, of stability, of the security that reason alone might give. The Chimer, fervent in faith, spoke of oaths, of divine guidance, of a land sanctified by gods. At first their words clashed like storm upon stone. Yet where others quarreled, Domak and Nerevar steadied the balance. Domak with patience, Nerevar with compassion, each tempering the pride of their kin, each reminding them of the greater purpose that lay ahead. The pact was not simple. Boundaries were debated, trade weighed against tradition, faith against silence. There were long nights of argument and longer days of uneasy compromise. But little by little, the vision took form. An alliance that would bind Dwemer and Chimer into a single strength, united against enemies beyond their borders. An agreement that would let both peoples endure, each retaining its ways, yet working together in the shadow of the same mountain. To mark this covenant, feasts were held. In the halls of the Dwemer, lamps glowed with steady light, and brass instruments sang in mechanical harmony. Among the Chimer, fires roared, drums thundered, and hymns rose into the night sky. Though their celebrations differed, though their songs bore different notes, for one fleeting span of days, they shared the same joy. The joy of peace, the joy of unity, the fragile joy of hope. Yet even as bonds were forged, beneath them lay tension. Some Chimer elders grumbled that no true alliance could be made with those who spurn the gods. Some Dwemer whispered that the Chimer's zeal would one day turn to chains, binding reason beneath superstition. But for now, those doubts were hushed, smothered by the glow of newfound kinship. For now, the dream of unity was enough to quiet even the harshest voices. So the first council was born, neither perfect nor permanent, but real. And in that moment, the land of Restain, long divided, felt the stirring of something new. Not conquest, not submission, but alliance forged not in fire alone, but in will. It was a fragile beginning, as fragile as glass upon stone, yet within it dwelled the promise of greatness. Thus Domac and Nerevar, once strangers, now stood as brothers in arms. Their hands clasped, their words sealed, and their peoples bound together by oaths spoken before ash and mountain. For a time, it seemed the land itself sighed in relief, as though the endless quarrels of ages had quieted. For a time, it seemed that unity might endure. The first council was forged, and for a moment, the land knew quiet. But peace, like glass, is fragile, and beneath its surface, cracks began to spread. Though Domac and Nerevar clasped hands in brotherhood, not every heart followed their example. Old habits lingered, old doubts whispered, and in the shadows, dissent began to stir. Among the Chimer, many elders looked upon the Dwemer with suspicion that no treaty could soothe. How could a people who spurned the gods be trusted to honor oaths sworn in their presence? How could they, who denied Azura's guidance, be counted as kin? Priests muttered that alliances built on silence would crumble, for silence was emptiness, not truth. Some warned Nerevar that to clasp Domac's hand was to clasp a serpent, smooth in touch, but coiled with danger. And though Nerevar trusted his friend, those murmurs fell heavy upon him, like dust settling unseen upon a flame. The Dwemer, too, carried unease. In their hidden halls, whispers spread that the Chimer's zeal would one day burn beyond control. What place had reason among those who bent their knees to unseen lords of shadow? What promise of peace could endure when bound by faith so fierce it consumed even kin? To many Dwemer, the Chimer were allies in name alone, their fervor a fire that might one day scorch brass and stone alike. And though Domac's voice carried weight, even his wisdom could not silence every doubt. These whispers grew not in open halls, but in quiet corners, in secret councils, in the soft words exchanged between kin. They were not yet daggers, but seeds that would root deep and sprout when the storm came. The first council stood, but it stood upon uneasy ground, its foundation strong in vision, yet fragile in trust. Still, life continued. Caravans passed between Dwemer halls and Chimer villages, carrying goods, carrying stories. Craftsmen shared tools, hunters shared furs, and children of both peoples played in the same ash-laden fields. For every whisper of mistrust, there was also laughter, also trade, also friendship. The dream of unity lived, if only in fragments, if only in fleeting moments where doubt fell quiet. But history is never woven only of peace. It is shaped by the unseen as much as the seen, by the murmurs as much as the proclamations. And so it was that beneath the surface of the First Council, tension grew. Some voices warned of betrayal, others of weakness, others of doom. They were voices soft as wind through stone, yet in time they would gather strength enough to shake the mountain itself. For now, the council endured, its oaths unbroken, its leaders steadfast. But in the stillness of night, when ash fell gently upon the land, one could almost hear the whispers rising, the quiet murmur of mistrust, the faint stirrings of betrayal, the first notes of a song that would one day crescendo into war. Beneath Red Mountain, deeper than even Dwemer's proudest halls, there stirred a secret long buried. Stone hid it, ash veiled it, yet in time the Dwemer's searching hands uncovered what others would never dare to seek. It was not ore, nor jewel, nor vein of metal that gleamed in firelight. It was older than stone, older than the mountain itself, older even than Mare. The Dwemer named it the Heart, and with awe and with ambition they gazed upon the remnant of Lorkhan, the god who had tricked creation into being. For ages, legends had spoken of Lorkhan's sundered body, of his divine spark scattered across the world. The Heart was said to be that spark, the very engine of existence, torn from the chest of a god and left to beat eternally beneath the earth. To the Chimer, such a relic was a holy warning, a reminder of hubris punished and a god's body sealed away by divine decree. But to the Dwemer, it was not a curse, it was possibility. If the Heart still pulsed with godhood, then perhaps divinity was not beyond reach. Perhaps eternity could be grasped not through prayer, but through craft. Chief among those who gazed upon it was Kagrenac, high engineer, architect of wonders, philosopher of tones. He was the Dwemer's greatest mind, a thinker who saw not stone or brass as limit, but as canvas. To him, the Heart was not a forbidden relic, but the key to a question the Dwemer had long pursued. What is the soul, and can it be mastered? He forged tools of unimaginable precision, keening, sunder, and wraithguard, crafted to shape the Heart's power as a sculptor shapes clay. Through these, he dreamed of drawing upon godhood itself, not to worship, but to wield. The Dwemer whispered of his vision in hushed tones. Some saw salvation, the promise of immortality, a people lifted beyond death and decay. Others felt unease, sensing the peril of touching that which was never meant for mortal hand. But Kagrenac was resolute, and Dwemer, though cautious, gave him leave. For in Dwemer thought, danger was but another puzzle, and every puzzle demanded a solution. When word of this discovery reached the Chimer, unease hardened into fear. To them, the Heart was sacred, untouchable, a relic bound by the will of gods. To shape it with tools, to harness its spark, was blasphemy beyond measure. Priests cried out that such hubris would draw Azura's wrath, that no pact could survive such sacrilege. Even Nerevar, loyal friend to Dwemer, felt doubt heavy in his chest. He trusted his brother king, yet in this secret he sensed a shadow long and deep, a wound that could not heal. Still, the work continued. In chambers hidden from the sun, Kagrenac's forges rang day and night. The air trembled with power, as if the mountain itself stirred in protest. And those who served at his side began to speak of visions, dreams of light too bright to bear, of voices that were not their own, of eternity pressing down like weight of stone. The Heart beat on, silent yet thunderous, a rhythm that echoed through the bones of all who drew near. Thus was the secret revealed, and thus began the unraveling. For in the Heart's discovery lay the seed of all that was to come, the hope of immortality, the fear of blasphemy, the spark that would ignite war. It was the moment when unity first trembled, when friendship strained, when the land itself seemed to hold its breath. And though no blade was yet drawn, the path to Red Mountain's shattering had already begun. The Heart's discovery did not echo only through Dwemer halls. Its whispers drifted outward, carried on rumor, on half-seen truths, on the uneasy silence of those who feared what had been uncovered. Among the Chimer, priests trembled, claiming they felt Azura's gaze grow heavier upon the land. Among the Dwemer, doubts too began to coil, though fewer dared to speak them aloud. And between the two peoples, once bound by fragile covenant, suspicion spread like cracks across glass. For the Chimer, the matter was clear. The Heart of Lorkhan was no tool, no prize, no treasure to be shaped. It was a divine warning, a remnant of deceit punished, a relic meant to rest forever in the secrecy of stone. That the Dwemer not only unearthed it, but sought to harness it was, in their eyes, the height of arrogance. What gods had sealed, mortals must not unseal. What gods had struck down, mortals must not exalt. To reach for the heart was to reach into the fire of creation itself, and none could touch such fire and live unscorched. But among the Dwemer, the vision gleamed with promise. They spoke of Kagrenac's genius in hushed reverence, of a new dawn where death itself might be conquered. Was this not the culmination of all their striving, the fulfillment of their reason and craft? They believed themselves on the threshold of eternity, a step away from transcending the limits that bound all mortal kind. Why should they halt? Simply because others cloaked fear in the language of faith. To them, the heart was not blasphemy. It was destiny waiting to be claimed. Thus murmurs became sharper, suspicion deeper. The Chimer questioned Nerevar's loyalty. How could their champion clasp Dumac's hand when Dumac's people dared profane the gods? Some whispered that Nerevar himself had been swayed by Dwemer pride, that he would betray Velitha's covenant for the sake of friendship. Meanwhile, the Dwemer eyed the Chimer warily, convinced that jealousy, not piety, drove their anger. They saw in their allies not partners, but would-be tyrants, eager to shackle reason beneath chains of prayer. Nerevar, caught between, walked a path of anguish. His heart yearned for unity, his soul for faith, his loyalty for friendship. He trusted Dumac, yet the voices of his people rang louder with each passing day. He prayed to Azura, seeking guidance, but her answers came only in riddles, her visions cloaked in twilight. And so the weight upon him grew, as though the ring of moon and star pressed heavier with each breath. Whispers became accusations. Accusations grew into anger. And though no blade was yet drawn, though Dumac and Nerevar still clasped hands as brothers, their peoples drifted apart like ships in storm. Every meeting of council bore sharper words. Every trade carried tension like hidden embers. The dream of unity dimmed, and the shadow of betrayal lengthened across the land. So it was that before a single sword was raised, the war had already begun, not in battlefields, but in hearts. It began with fear, with suspicion, with the quiet murmur that echoed in every hall and every hearth. The heart beat on, patient and eternal, while mortals quarreled above it. And in its silent rhythm, one could almost hear the inevitability of what was to come. The storm could not be stilled forever. Whispers had grown into anger, and anger into open cries. What began as quiet doubt now spilled into the light of day, and the fragile bonds of the first council began to tear. The Chimer would not suffer the Dwemer to shape the heart, and the Dwemer would not surrender what they deemed the pinnacle of their craft. Soash once more became battlefield, and Restain trembled beneath the tread of armies. The first skirmishes were small, yet bitter. Bands of Chimer warriors descended upon Dwemer caravans, claiming them cursed, their wares tainted by blasphemy. Dwemer sentries retaliated, striking swift with machines of brass that marched like tireless guardians. At first, both sides sought restraint, hoping still for reconciliation. But restraint proved fragile, and soon blood stained the ash fields once more. Temples of the Chimer rang with sermons of warning. Priests declared that Azura herself had spoken, that doom would fall upon any who stood with the Dwemer. Every death upon the field was cast as proof of divine wrath. To the faithful, the war was not of politics, nor of land, but of soul itself. Chimer against those who defied the gods. And in their fervor, many found not grief in war, but grim purpose, convinced their cause was holy. The Dwemer spoke with voices of reason, but beneath their logic burned equal fire. They claimed the Chimer sought to chain knowledge, to bury truth beneath superstition. Each assault upon their halls was met not only with steel, but with invention. Engines that spat fire, constructs that guarded tirelessly, weapons wrought with brilliance that rivaled magic. They called their struggle not rebellion, but liberation, from fear, from faith, from the tyranny of unseen powers. And so the mountain valleys rang with clash of sword and hiss of steam. Ash clouds darkened skies, already heavy with smoke. Villages burned, halls fell silent, and kin were torn from kin. Yet Dwemer and Nerevar, though now bound as foes upon the field, still hesitated to strike fully at one another. Their friendship, though strained, remained a thread unbroken, each hoping against hope that peace might yet be reclaimed. But war is not stilled by hope alone. Every death deepened hatred, every skirmish widened the rift. Soon, armies marched not in bands but in legions. Drums thundered, horns sounded, and banners rose above the ash. The first council, once dream of unity, was now memory only, its promise shattered beneath the weight of war. So dawn broke upon a land divided, its people sworn no longer to brotherhood, but to battle. The heart beat on, patient, eternal, untouched beneath the mountain. Above it, mortals waged their war, blind to the depth of the storm they had awakened. And in the soft, endless rhythm of that divine pulse, destiny stirred, awaiting the moment when battle would reach its peak and fate itself would be remade. War spread across the ashlands, and with it came the heavy weight of command. For Dwemer and Nerevar, once brothers in covenant, the burden was doubly cruel. Each was bound by loyalty to his people, yet chained by memory of friendship. They had clasped hands as allies, but now those same hands drew steel against one another. In the stillness of night, both kings wept in silence. Nerevar bore the cries of the faithful. His priests warned him that mercy toward the Dwemer was weakness, that Azura's wrath would fall upon all if he faltered. They painted Dwemer not as friend, but as betrayer, as profaner of the sacred, as enemy to the gods themselves. To disobey was to risk his people's trust. To obey was to wound his own heart. Thus each command he gave felt like a blade turned inward. Every victory a sorrow cloaked as triumph. Dwemer too walked in shadow. Among the Dwemer, pride in Kagrenac's work grew fierce, and doubt of the Chimer deepened. His people pressed him for strength, for resolve, for the certainty that they alone were right. Yet Dwemer remembered Nerevar's voice, remembered the days when unity had seemed within reach. He asked himself whether reason had been lost to ambition, whether friendship had been sacrificed to pride. But a king cannot rule by memory alone, and so he steeled himself, speaking words of certainty though his soul trembled. Both leaders longed for peace, yet peace slipped further with every dawn. Messages once written in hope now bore only threats. Meetings once held in trust now ended in silence. And as the weight of command pressed heavier, the men beneath crowns became shadows of themselves, haunted, weary, yet bound to paths they could not abandon. Soldiers, too, felt the burden. Chimer warriors, though zealous, grieved for kin slain upon the field. Dwemer legions, though tireless, wondered at the cost of victory. Yet still they marched, for their lords commanded it, and lords, too, were prisoners of fate. So the war fed upon itself, each wound breeding another, each sorrow giving birth to rage. At times, when battle paused, Dwemer and Nerevar still sought counsel. They met in hidden chambers, voices low, speaking not as kings but as brothers. They asked one another if unity might yet be restored, if some path remained untrodden. But between them lay the heart, beating, silent, eternal, and neither could give it up. So even their words, tender and strained, dissolved like smoke, leaving only silence. Thus the burden of command grew heavier, shaping them as surely as the mountain shaped the land. They were leaders, champions, kings, yet also men. Men bound by duty, men scarred by loss, men torn between love and loyalty. And though the war raged on, beneath every clash of sword and roar of engine, one could almost hear the quieter sound. The sound of hearts breaking, slowly, beneath the weight of command. Even as war raged across the Ashlands, stories began to take shape. For in every battle, in every act of valor or sacrifice, mortals sought meaning, and meaning soon became myth. The War of the First Council was not only a clash of steel and steam. It was a forge of legends, tales whispered by firesides and sung in halls even before the dust had settled. Among the Chimer, songs rose of saints and martyrs. Warriors who fell upon Dwemer machines were remembered not as lost, but as holy offerings, their spirits lifted to Azura's side. Priests told of visions where ancestors walked the battlefields unseen, guiding blades and shielding the faithful. Every skirmish became more than war. It became a story of divine struggle, where each act of courage was a spark of godly favor. Among the Dwemer, legends too grew. They spoke of generals who commanded with brilliance, of constructs that marched tirelessly into flame, of Kagrenac's tools gleaming with unearthly light. Tales spread of soldiers who stood unbroken against waves of foes, not by blessing of gods, but by strength of will and cunning of craft. Each victory was retold as proof of reason's triumph, each defense as evidence that brass and stone could endure where faith would falter. Yet not all tales were triumphant. Some told of sorrow, of brothers who found one another across the field, only to fall by each other's hand. Others told of villages caught between armies, their homes turned to ash by war they had not chosen. In these darker stories lay the truth of conflict, the grief, the emptiness, the silence left in the wake of battle. But even grief became myth, wrapped in reverence, given form as parable to endure. Bards and storytellers, though weary, carried these tales across the land. Their voices softened the horror, shaping chaos into order, suffering into meaning. For to live in war is to seek comfort in story, to believe that each loss is part of a greater tapestry, each wound a stitch in the fabric of destiny. And so legends grew not after the war, but within it, blossoming like flowers even in ash. Children, huddled beside the weary, learned of heroes who bore the stars upon their brow, of kings who shone like fire amid shadow. Soldiers, before battle, spoke names of the fallen as blessings, believing that in remembering, they carried their spirits forward. And in every telling, Dwemer and Nerevar stood taller, no longer only kings, but figures already half divine in the eyes of those who followed them. Thus war, even as it destroyed, also created. It created memory, myth, legend, stories that softened grief, stories that gave purpose, stories that shaped the very way the people of Restain would remember themselves. For when the dust of battles fades, what endures is not the clash of sword upon shield, but the whisper of tales passed from one generation to the next. And so the War of the First Council became more than history. It became song, dream, and legend, echoing softly even in the midst of strife. Amid the war's chaos, three figures of the Chimer began to shine with a light that seemed almost beyond mortal. They were not kings, nor crowned lords of battle, yet their presence upon the field carried a weight equal to banners and horns. Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothis Sil, names that in later days would be spoken as gods, were in these years still mortal. Yet even then, stories began to gather around them like stars around the moon. Almalexia, beloved mother of her people, strode among the wounded. She carried not only sword, but healing hand, and tale spread that her touch could knit flesh, that her voice alone could ease pain deeper than wounds of steel. Warriors spoke of her as shield incarnate, a living guardian whose strength never waned, whose compassion never faltered. Her name was sung in temples and whispered in camps, a comfort in darkness, a beacon amid smoke. Vivek, poet and warrior both, wove language into weapon and weapon into song. He walked the lines of soldiers, speaking words that turned fear into fire, doubt into resolve. When he strode into battle, his spear gleamed like starlight, and Bard swore that his very presence bent the rhythm of combat, shaping chaos into verse. Some claimed his words were prophecy, others that his voice carried the cadence of divinity. Yet all agreed that where Vivek stood, the chimers' hearts grew fierce. Sotha's Sill, most silent of the three, was less often seen, yet stories of him spread like murmured secrets. He dwelled not in camps, but in hidden chambers, crafting wonders few could name, weaving magic subtle as breath. Some said he walked unseen among Dwemer halls, learning their secrets. Others whispered he spoke with stars themselves, or wandered dream realms where only seers might tread. Though his face was seldom glimpsed, his presence was felt, a quiet certainty that fate was being shaped in shadows. Together, they became a triad in the people's imagination, a trinity of compassion, inspiration, and mystery. Even before apotheosis, they were remembered as more than mortal, their deeds clothed in reverence. For when a people suffer, they seek not only warriors, but saviors. And so the tribunal, though not yet divine, already walked the first steps upon that path. These myths grew swiftly, nourished by grief, by longing, by hope. Children spoke of them as if they were saints. Soldiers prayed in their names before battle. Priests folded their deeds into sermons, casting them as chosen guides who walked beside the people in their hour of need. And thus faith, once bound solely to the Daedra, began to shift, subtle, fragile, yet certain as dawn. The Dwemer too heard these tales, and many scoffed. They saw only mortals adorned in story, magnified by faith's unblinking eye. Yet even scoffing could not still the growing current, for legend is a tide, and tides do not wait for reason's approval. What began as rumor became belief, and belief in time became truth, not because it was proven, but because it was told and told and told again. Thus, in the heart of war, myths of the tribunal blossomed, and though they were not yet gods, the people already began to see them as more than flesh, more than leaders, as destinies chosen, walking paths none else could tread. War does not shape only kings and generals. It shapes the rhythm of every life beneath its shadow. In Restain, as battles raged and legends grew, the daily world of both Chimer and Dwemer was transformed. The war entered their hearths, their fields, their halls, until even the simplest acts of living bore its weight. For the Chimer, faith deepened. Temples filled with worshippers, not only seeking solace, but demanding guidance. Priests spoke with voices sharpened by war, declaring that each moment of labor, each prayer whispered, was part of holy struggle. Mothers sang lullabies that were half prayer. Fathers taught children that their very breath was owed to the gods' protection. Even those who had once doubted found themselves drawn into the current. For in war, faith offered certainty, and certainty was a balm. In villages near the front, daily life bent beneath constant fear. Ash storms carried the sound of distant engines, and children learned to read the sky not for weather, but for signs of marching legions. Crops were gathered swiftly, herds moved under cover of night, for raids could fall as sudden as storms. Yet amid hardship, bonds of kinship grew fierce. Neighbors watched over one another, shared what little they had, and found strength in unity. Thus war, though it took much, also wove communities tighter, binding them in shared endurance. For the Dwemer, society turned ever more to craft. Forges burned without ceasing. Workshops rang with hammer and chisel, and invention became both shield and bread. Young apprentices who once studied simple gears were now set to fashioning arms of war. Every household contributed to the great endeavor, whether by shaping metal, tending engines, or carrying fuel to the endless furnaces. To them, each creation was part of the larger struggle, a proof of reason's power against the storm of faith. In their halls, Art and music did not cease, but even these bent to the needs of war. Songs praised not gods, but engineers. Poems told not of spirits, but of triumphs of design. Beauty became entwined with purpose. Every craft a testament that their people would endure not by prayer, but by skill. Thus both societies, though different, were reshaped by the same fire. Faith for the Chimer, craft for the Dwemer. Temples and forges alike became sanctuaries of survival. And in both, stories of the war entered the very marrow of life. Children played at being Tribunal or Kagrenac, wielding sticks as spears or pretending at hammers that shaped the heart itself. Elders gathered in quiet, repeated tales that blurred line between truth and myth, binding memory to legend. So the war was not only fought in valleys or upon mountainsides, it was fought in kitchens, in forges, in songs and prayers. It became the unseen rhythm of every moment, a tide that carried all within its flow. And as days passed into seasons, the people of Restain were no longer who they had been. They were a people tempered, reshaped, their very lives molded by conflict into forms that would endure long after the final battle was fought. As the war stretched on, the influence of Vivec, Almalexia, and Sothis Sil deepened, weaving itself not only into legend, but into the very fabric of daily life. Though they were not yet gods, their presence began to shape the Chimer in ways that reached beyond battlefield and temple, planting seeds of transformation that would long outlast the war itself. Almalexia's touch was felt most keenly among the common folk. Her compassion, her tireless care for the wounded, and her voice that soothed sorrow, all gave her an authority beyond any crown. Villages invoked her name in prayer, not as distant figure, but as living mother. Families carried her likeness in charms, believing her gaze alone would guard their homes. In her, the Chimer saw mercy made flesh, and society itself began to lean upon her as upon a pillar of unshakable strength. Vivec's words spread like fire. He spoke not only to soldiers, but to poets, craftsmen, even children gathered in the dust. His verses shaped thought as surely as his spear shaped battle. Through him, the Chimer found language for their struggle, words that framed sorrow as beauty, sacrifice as purpose. Where once stories belonged to priests, they now belonged to Vivec's voice, and the rhythm of his speech began to echo through the speech of all. He gave the people not only courage, but narrative, turning war into something greater than grief, something that could be endured. Sothis Sil, though hidden, influenced in subtler ways. His workings, strange and secret, gave rise to wonders that seemed to bridge the gap between faith and reason. New enchantments flowed from his hand, wards that guarded homes, devices that aided soldiers. Though few saw him, his presence was everywhere, like shadow cast by flame unseen. Many spoke of him not as man, but as mystery, a mind already beyond mortal thought. Thus his silence became a kind of guidance, a reminder that unseen labors too held power. Together, the three formed a balance: compassion, inspiration, and wisdom. Even before divinity, they stood as more than leaders. They became symbols, embodiments of what the Chimer longed to be. Merciful yet strong, poetic yet fierce, wise yet unyielding. Their names slipped into every prayer, every song, every story whispered in the dark. The Daedra were still revered, yet slowly, quietly, the Tribunal's shadow lengthened, shaping faith itself. Among the Dwemer, this rising influence was seen with wary eyes. To them, it was proof of Chimer zeal, a sign that reason's voice would soon be drowned entirely beneath the tide of myth. Yet even their scorn only fed the current, for opposition gave sharper edge to faith. The Chimer clung to the Tribunal more fiercely with every challenge, believing that in these three their destiny was already written. Thus society bent beneath their presence, reshaped not by decree but by devotion. And though crowns and thrones still held power, it was clear that the hearts of the people had already shifted. The Tribunal, though not yet divine, were already sovereign in spirit, guiding a people who yearned for certainty, for hope, for something more than mortal. Long before the final battle was fought, the people of Restane began to weave memory into form. For war, though cruel, demands remembrance, and in every ruin, in every ash-stained village, the urge to preserve grew strong. Thus, even as swords clashed and machines roared, monuments were raised, songs were sung, and stories carved into the bones of the land. Among the Chimera, temples became sanctuaries not only of faith but of memory. Priests set aside chambers where names of the fallen were inscribed upon walls, each etched letter of prayer, each prayer a vow that none would be forgotten. Candles burned day and night, their smoke rising like whispers to the sky. Families came to kneel, touching names with trembling hands, finding solace in the thought that memory itself was holy. Stone cairns dotted the ashlands, built by soldiers when battle stilled. Each pile of rock marked the place where comrades had fallen, and around them warriors gathered in silence. Songs of mourning rose low and slow, sung not for triumph, but for tenderness, a reminder that beneath armor and oath, each soul was kin. Thus, even in war, gentleness endured, carved into ritual by those who refused to let grief vanish into dust. The Dwemer, too, preserved, though in their own manner. Their forges rang not only with weapons, but with memorials of brass and stone. Engraved tablets bore the names of engineers and soldiers alike, framed not in prayer, but in record, as precise as the turning of a gear. In their halls, statues stood, figures not idealized, but exact, captured in detail as though to defy the forgetting hand of time. For to them, memory was not sacred mystery, but proof, a record that reason itself demanded. Songs also grew, carrying memory farther than stone. Bards wandered ash-swept roads, singing laments of heroes, ballads of sacrifice, verses that softened wounds. Children repeated these songs until they knew them by heart, and thus memory spread not only in temple or forge, but in the living voices of the people. Even those who never saw battle carried the war within them, for its stories were everywhere, woven into daily breath. In this way, memory itself became a shield. To remember was to resist despair, to prove that no life was wasted, that even in ash, something endured. The act of remembrance bound the people together, shaping them not only as survivors, but as a society defined by the echoes of its struggle. And so, long before victory or defeat, the war had already become more than conflict. It had become memory, etched in stone, in song, in ritual. The people of Restane, both Chimera and Dwemer, ensured that their losses would not dissolve into silence. And in doing so, they began the first shaping of history itself, a history that would echo long after the last blade was lowered. In time, remembrance grew beyond single moments of grief and became a culture unto itself. The people of Restane wove memory into every custom, every gathering, until to live was also to remember. Even amid war's uncertainty, the act of recalling the fallen became a quiet foundation on which all else rested. Among the Chimera, remembrance entered the rhythm of worship. Temples held seasonal rites, where priests recited long lines of names, each spoken aloud like a stone placed upon eternity. Families offered small tokens, woven cloth, carved wood, handfuls of ash placed upon altars to honor those who had gone. In every village, these rituals carried the same message, that memory itself was sacred and that forgetting was the only true death. Songs grew longer, more elaborate. What began as battlefield laments became epic chants, carried by generations of singers. Each verse told of places, of victories and losses, of individuals whose deeds would otherwise fade. To hear these songs was to hear not only music, but history, living and breathing. In the hush of night, when fires burned low, voices rose together, blending grief and hope, weaving sorrow into a net that held despair at bay. The Dwemer, though different in spirit, also built culture around remembrance. Their records became ever more meticulous, inscribing the smallest details of battles and inventions. Chronicles were etched upon great walls of brass, layered with precision, as though memory itself were designed to be perfected. Some halls became libraries of stone and metal, where each name and each act was recorded, not with weeping, but with certainty. In their way, they too honored the fallen, not with tears, but with permanence, ensuring that no life, no creation was erased. Communal feasts arose as well. In both camps, food was shared on nights when the moons were full and stories told of those who had passed. Children listened wide-eyed as elders spoke, learning that to speak of the dead was not to reopen pain, but to keep bonds alive. Thus, remembrance was not only private sorrow, but public strength, an affirmation that the people endured together. Over time, this culture of remembrance began to shape identity. To be Chimer was to live with faith and memory intertwined, every prayer echoing the names of ancestors. To be Dwemer was to preserve truth in form, every gear and tablet a testimony to those who had labored before. Though different in form, both peoples carried their past with reverence, bound by the conviction that no loss could be allowed to vanish. And so remembrance became more than ritual. It became inheritance, a way of life, a thread carried forward from generation to generation. The war, though still raging, had already given them this enduring gift, a culture that could not forget, a society whose very heartbeat was memory. When the war's fires dimmed and silence at last returned to the valleys of Restain, the land bore scars that would not soon fade. Ash lay heavy where once fields had blossomed. Ruins stood where once halls had rung with laughter, and graves stretched farther than the eye could see. Yet amid loss, a new shape of destiny emerged, and at its heart stood the Tribunal. Though born as mortals, their legend had swelled beyond measure. Almalexia, healer and mother, remained the people's shield, remembered not for victories of steel, but for endless compassion. Vivek, poet and warrior, lingered in every verse, every chant, his voice still echoing in the speech of his people. Sotha's Sil, silent architect, was spoken of in whispers, his mysteries seen as proof that the Chimer walked beside wonders not yet known. Together, they became more than figures of war. They became symbols of endurance, promise, and possibility. The Daedra, once unquestioned patrons, now shared devotion with this living triad. Faith shifted, subtle yet unstoppable, until temples once built for old gods found their walls resounding with prayers to new ones. The people, hungering for certainty after so much grief, gave themselves wholly to these three. For who else had walked beside them? Who else had borne their suffering? Who else had guided them through endless night? The Dwemer, though vanished from the land, left behind silence more profound than defeat. Their halls, their machines, their wisdom gone. Only empty ruins remained, filled with echoes of forges long cold. Their departure, whether by choice or doom, became itself a story, one more mystery folded into the shadow of the Tribunal's rise. And so, in absence, they too shaped legacy, not by presence but by void. The war had promised triumph or ruin, yet it gave birth instead to something stranger, transformation. It was no longer merely a struggle between Chimer and Dwemer, faith and reason, myth and machine. It became the crucible from which a new order emerged, one that would shape centuries yet to come. The Tribunal, once mortal, now stood upon the threshold of divinity, and with them, the Chimer people stepped into a future forever altered. Thus the legacy of the war was not only ash and sorrow. It was also the birth of gods, the reshaping of belief, and the forging of memory into something eternal. Where steel had clashed and voices had cried out, silence now held the weight of destiny. And in that silence, the Tribunal's path was set. The tale of the war of the First Council does not end with the clang of swords, nor with the silence of abandoned halls. It lingers like the glow of twilight upon ash, neither day nor night, but something between. For in every story of battle lies a deeper current, one that speaks not of victory or defeat, but of what remains when the dust has settled. The tribunal rose from war not merely as heroes, but as vessels of transformation. They bore the faith of their people, carried upon shoulders weary yet unbroken. They became more than flesh, more than leaders, symbols upon which an entire nation leaned. Almalexia's mercy, Vivek's voice, Sotha Sil's silence, all became pillars of a new world. And in their shadow, the Chimer found not only solace, but destiny. The Dwemer, though absent, are never truly gone. Their silence is a presence, their ruins a voice without words. Every empty corridor, every half-buried machine, speaks of their ambition, their brilliance, and their mystery. Though the people who forged them have vanished, their absence itself is remembered, a riddle carved into the marrow of history. In forgetting, they endure. In vanishing, they remain. So the war's legacy is not a single thread, but a tapestry. It is woven of memory and myth, of faith and doubt, of gods risen and people remade. Each stone in Restain bears it. Each song recalls it. Each whispered prayer carries it forward. And though time stretches on, those centuries veil the truth in shadow, the story persists, soft as breath, unending as night. To speak of this war is to walk through dream. A dream where mortals touch divinity, where faith contends with reason, where silence echoes louder than words. A dream that does not end with waking, but lingers, shaping thought long after the telling is done. And perhaps that is the truest legacy, that in remembering, we are drawn not to certainty, but to wonder. So let this story rest now, as night rests upon the world. Let memory be a lantern in the dark. Let myth be a gentle tide that carries us onward. For in the land of Restain, in the shadow of the tribunal, and in the silence of the Dwemer, the echoes of the first council still drift, soft as whispers across the ash. And those whispers, like dreams, endure,